and now I'll survive.
Every school had that kid. That kid was a bit of a weirdo. That kid might have had something wrong with him. That kid was always getting up to some new and wacky shenanigans. He was clearly not on the same wavelength as the rest of the student populace, and maybe it was just because he was built different, but one thing is for certain. Every single school in this country, maybe even abroad, every single school had that kid. I remember that kid that we had at our school. He was there for the entirety of my high school experience, ranging from 2014 to 2018, and we still tell stories about his exploits to this very day, like I'm going to in this video. I remember walking into school, the year was 2014, I was a freshman, walking to the back hallway where all the freshmen would stay in the 30 minutes or so before classes started, and looking around and seeing a new fresh face amongst the freshman populace. He was around my height, not very tall, fat, pale, and there was a strange energy about him that I couldn't put my finger on whenever I first saw him. Something was definitely not right, but it wouldn't be until the first class that day that I eventually found out what it was. You see, my first class that day and that year was World Civilizations. It was effectively a history class which focused on, as it stated, world civilizations. We went in there and found that the desks were arranged in little groups of fours in every corner of the room. Wouldn't you know it, I got stuck right next to the new kid. Now, the teacher was admittedly one of my favorite teachers. Me and her got along very well. I've always been a fan of history, and she was a lot more monotone than even I was, even back then before I knew how to speak properly. But the biggest issue that I had with her was that for an entire year, I was sat next to this individual. You see, it was not by mistake that all of the desks were in groups of fours. We were going to be working in groups several times throughout the year, and wouldn't you know it, she thought that it would be a good idea to allow the groups to name themselves. Everyone had some somewhat comedic or in-joke sort of name for theirs, and by the time she had gotten to us, we had not really decided on anything because no one had thrown out any suggestions. She got to us, we decided, well, we'll just let the new kid choose. The very first thing that came out of this man's mouth was the Bandicoots. Now, keep in mind, we are 14 years old around this time, we are freshmen in high school, everyone is walking on eggshells to try to not seem like some weirdo, and this man just named our group after a 1990s platforming mascot that, admittedly, not a lot of people in my class had played. They did not understand the reference, and we got a lot of weird looks after that. Now, keep in mind, this was the first impression I got of this individual, and it did not get any better from there. A matter of fact, it went downhill very quickly. You see, it was around fall of 2014 whenever we started school there, and that means that there had been a very popular game that had recently came out in August of 2014. Yes, a game called Five Nights at Freddy's, and wouldn't you know it, that kid was a fan of it. I can't remember exactly if there was context. I'm fairly certain we weren't talking about the game, but he looked over and said, "Hey, have you ever played Five Nights at Freddy's?" I said, "Well, I've never played it, but I've heard of it." He said, "Yeah, I really like that game. I wish I could be one of the robots there inside of the pizzeria and run down the hallway and bite the frontal lobe off of a night guard." And when he said bite, he sort of gnashed his teeth a little bit. He sort of showed those fucking chompers. That was definitely something that sort of set the tone for everything going forward. I then came to find out that the person I was sitting next to was very clearly not right in the head. He wasn't normal. And as I said, it got worse and worse from there. The final story I have of freshman year of that kid was whenever we were talking about the reasons that wars happen. At one point, they began talking about extremism and religious ideologies, and of course, you can't talk about these things without bringing up Osama bin Laden and 9/11. Now, that kid, an intense patriot that he was, he decided to slam his fist down on the table and say, "I wish I could just find Osama's grave and just shoot it." And me, being the little smart-ass autistic kid that I was, I looked at him and I said, "He was buried at sea, and he's already dead. Why would you want to shoot him?" He looked over at me, and the few words that came out of his mouth, he said, "Shut up, you Nazi." Now, I wasn't making any references to the Third Reich whenever I was trying to dunk on this man, trying to own the libs in his direction, but this would become a common and recurring thing with him. If he ever had any beef with anybody, he would immediately call them a skinhead or some skinhead-adjacent terminology. In sophomore year, things heated up a tad bit. He had started catching a little bit of flack from the student populace because they understood that he was a little bit different in the head. I recall one event where he was sitting in geometry class, and a couple of buddies of mine were trying to make fun of him, claiming that a part of his anatomy was significantly smaller than the rest of us. They did this for a good 10 to 15 minutes, and eventually, as the bell rang, he stood up, got ready to storm out, and when he was in the doorway, turned around and said very loudly, "I'll have you know it's a solid 5 inches and it curves to the right." And from there, a new nickname was born, Captain Hook. But that's not the only thing that happened in sophomore year. Matter of fact, one of his most significant events happened in sophomore year. As I was walking into a math class one day, I saw a bunch of people huddling around a phone over in a corner and laughing like madmen. Now, I didn't know if there was something funny that had happened. I didn't know if there was some news or anything, but eventually word got around to me that someone had went into the bathroom and taken a picture where someone had dropped it like it was hot all over the floor. They had dropped trow and completely and totally decimated the floor of the bathroom, right next to the lobby, mind you. This was a very high-stakes game. There was no way that these people would not be caught. And for a good 3 to 4 class periods, there were people who were on the lookout for this mysterious phantom shitter. And eventually, wouldn't you know, that kid was called into the principal's office. Now, he tried to play it off as if he was purely being called in there for excessive tardiness, but he was somewhat punctual to all of his classes, so that didn't really stand. We knew for a fact that there was something fishy up. And eventually, we got all but confirmation because he was suspended for this so-called excessive tardiness, which is not something you would expect to happen in that event. That was also the birth of another nickname, Stanley Steamer. Junior year, what I would refer to as the biggest event involving this individual happened. You see, he would sit in the leftmost, frontmost seat in our English class that we shared. And most of the time, he would be sitting there on his phone doing God knows what, while the rest of us were doing bookwork. And wouldn't you know it, no one in the class seemed to enjoy that. No one enjoyed it in the slightest. Everyone hated it. And some people hated this a little more than the rest of everybody else, to the point that they decided they were going to look over his shoulder and try to find out what he was looking at. What they saw staring back at them was a social media profile on a now-defunct social media platform known as Google+. And the account that was staring back at them seemed to have a lot of certain specific interest. Now, I'm going to have to dance around some of the terminology so as to not make this video as profane and disgusting as I could, but to give you a brief description of what was seen on there, I will say there were fat Lucarios. I will say that there were a couple of Star Fox recolored OCs. I will say that there were entire paragraphs of ERP. And I will also say there was a laundry list of strange and degenerate fetishes that honestly would make a whore blush. We were wholeheartedly disgusted. We were somewhat traumatized. But once we found it out, we couldn't stop laughing to ourselves. It was strange. It was like it was driving us insane. So naturally, we decided that the correct course of action would be to compile every single thing that was on that page into a large screen cap and distribute it to the class themselves. This eventually escalated as more and more people would just call out the name, his username of the Google Plus page in class, and he would get more and more violent trying to talk about it. Eventually, he decided to snitch to the principal, saying that he was being bullied, and wouldn't you know it, when called in there about the bullying that was going on, the girl who started this entire fiasco by looking over his shoulder said, "We wouldn't be bullying him if he would get off his phone and get off his Google Plus." And the principal and the head of punishment at that school, their ears perked up, their eyes widened, and they said, "Now a Google Plus? We haven't heard anything about this. What do you mean Google Plus?" She looked at them, she said, "Oh, you don't know?" And proceeded to give them the link to the Google Plus page. They stared at the screen, looked at each other, looked at the screen, did a double take, and said, both at the same time, simultaneously, like one of those movies from the 80s, "Bring that kid in here." To my knowledge, the conversation went something like this. They said, "Look, it's bad that they're bullying you, but you can't be doing this shit. This is disgusting. You can't be doing it, especially not in school." From there on out, he had sort of shown his hand, and that was sort of the climax of that kid's activities in the school. Senior year was a little bit different, though. There was a bit of a different energy, because this kid had endured about 3.5 years of being mocked openly, with jokes that he did not understand how to take properly. And senior year was sort of the year that we all started wondering whether or not his father had any type of weapons that he might have access to. This was the year that we sort of got freaked out that maybe we had pushed him a little bit too far. I call senior year the year of the credible threat, because we had a betting pool, you see. We had a betting pool that was half a joke, but also half completely and totally serious, that was basically listing off all the kids we thought were going to go off their rocker and try to do some wacky, dangerous Fed posting IRL at the school. He was at the top of the list and had the most bets placed on him. And now that we're out of high school, I haven't really heard anything from him in years, and maybe that's for the best. Maybe one day I'll turn on the news and I'll see that he's been embroiled in some weird Chris Chan level shit. I don't know. This video's dragging on a tad bit longer than I thought it would. In summary, in summation, every school had that kid. That kid was a bit of a symbol of the grade, a bit of a symbol of the year, a bit of a symbol of the generation that you grew up in inside of that school. He conjures up stories that are both horrific and hilarious at the same time. He is a figurehead of better times, even if those better times were at his expense. Every school had that kid. Just hope that you weren't him. Check me out on Twitter if you want, twitter.com/Hale_Keezer. My name is Keezer. I've never been good at outros. I'll see you next time.